In this episode, we're going to focus on a skill that separates a privacy technologist who is merely knowledgeable from one who can actually influence outcomes, advising ethical technology design in a way that can scale across teams, products, and years of change. Beginners often assume ethics is mostly about personal values and passionate arguments. But in technology organizations, ethical design becomes real only when it is turned into repeatable decisions, enforceable constraints, and habits that teams can follow even when deadlines are tight. Sustainable scale matters because a single privacy review meeting cannot keep up with modern product development, especially in cloud-heavy environments where features ship continuously and data flows are constantly evolving. Ethical advice that scales is practical, specific, and connected to how systems are built, measured, and maintained. It helps teams do the right thing by default, not only when a specialist is watching. By the end, you should have a clear sense of how to translate ethical goals into design guidance, how to communicate that guidance in engineering-friendly language, and how to create structures that keep the guidance alive over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to recognize that ethical technology design is not a separate layer you bolt onto a product after it is built, because ethics is expressed through defaults, flows, constraints, and incentives that are baked into the system. When a product makes it easy to collect data but hard to limit it, that is an ethical outcome, not a neutral technical fact. When a product makes it easy to opt in but confusing to opt out, that is an ethical outcome, not just a user experience detail. When a product stores behavioral history forever because nobody designed retention, that is an ethical outcome, not simply an operational convenience. Advising ethically means you look at the system and ask how it shapes user autonomy, how it distributes power between the organization and the user, and how it manages the risks of harm that arise from observation and inference. This matters for the CIPT exam because many scenario questions are not about whether a team can do something, but whether it should, and what design move would reduce harm while still supporting legitimate goals. Ethical advice becomes most useful when it is connected to concrete system behaviors, because that is where you can actually change outcomes. To advise ethically at scale, you need a small set of repeatable ethical principles that can be translated into technical and operational guidance without becoming vague slogans. One principle is respect for user autonomy, meaning people should be able to understand meaningful choices and have those choices honored in actual processing. Another principle is minimization, meaning collect and retain only what is needed for a defined purpose, because excess data amplifies risk and invites misuse. Another principle is context alignment, meaning data flows should match what people reasonably expect in the setting and should not quietly shift into unrelated uses. Another principle is fairness, meaning designs should avoid creating disproportionate harm to certain groups, especially when data-driven decisions affect opportunity. Another principle is accountability, meaning the organization should be able to explain and justify key decisions and correct mistakes without hiding behind complexity. These principles are not new, but what makes them scalable is turning each one into practical questions and design patterns that teams can apply repeatedly. For exam purposes, being able to connect a principle to a specific design action is often what distinguishes the best answer from a generic one. A major challenge in ethical advising is that teams often believe they are already acting ethically because they are not intending to harm anyone, and intention can create blind spots. Ethical risk in technology usually arises from second-order effects, like the way a dataset can be reused later, the way a model can infer sensitive traits, or the way small interface choices can steer users without them noticing. That means scalable ethical advice needs to be framed as risk reduction rather than moral judgment, because people respond better to guidance that helps them avoid failure than to guidance that implies they are bad. A useful approach is to talk about foreseeable misuse, foreseeable surprise, and foreseeable harm, because those are engineering-friendly concepts. You can explain that a design creates a foreseeable path for linkability, or that a retention choice creates a foreseeable long-term exposure surface, or that a consent flow creates a foreseeable misunderstanding. When you frame ethics as anticipating outcomes, you help teams see that ethical design is part of quality, not a separate political debate. The exam often rewards this kind of practical framing because it reflects the reality of how privacy work gets done. Ethical advising scales sustainably when it is built into the product lifecycle through predictable decision points rather than relying on ad hoc escalation. In a mature environment, there are moments where ethical and privacy concerns naturally intersect with design work, such as when a new data category is proposed, when a feature changes a processing purpose, when a vendor integration is introduced, or when a model is trained on user behavior. These moments are high leverage because small decisions there can prevent large harms later. A scalable approach is to define triggers that route these moments into review and to provide templates or check questions that make the review efficient. The goal is not to slow development, but to prevent surprises and rework by catching issues early. In cloud-heavy systems, where changes are frequent, trigger-based review is more sustainable than periodic audits because it focuses attention where change is happening. On the exam, choices that embed ethical review into change management and governance often reflect mature, scalable practice. A core part of ethical advice is guiding teams toward privacy-protective defaults, because defaults are where scale is won or lost. Most users do not change settings, not because they don't care, but because they are busy, they don't understand the implications, or the settings are buried. If your design relies on users to find and fix privacy risks themselves, you have created an unfair burden and you have weakened trust. Privacy-protective defaults might mean collecting the minimum necessary data unless a user explicitly enables an optional feature, or limiting sharing unless the user clearly chooses otherwise, or using shorter retention by default with a defined rationale for extension. Defaults also matter for internal access, because if many roles can access sensitive data by default, misuse becomes easier and detection becomes harder. Ethical advising here is very practical. You are recommending that the safest option be the easiest option. The exam often tests this indirectly by offering choices that depend on users reading long notices or finding obscure settings, and the stronger answer is usually the one that changes defaults and enforces constraints. Another scalable ethical pattern is purpose boundaries, meaning you design data flows so data collected for one purpose is not automatically available for unrelated purposes. In many organizations, purpose boundaries fail because data is centralized for convenience, and then many teams can use it for many reasons, which creates a slow drift into broad profiling and unexpected use. Advising ethically means you encourage architectures and governance that keep operational data, analytics data, and experimentation data separated by design, with clear rules about movement between contexts. It also means encouraging scoping identifiers so that cross-context linkage is not effortless. Purpose boundaries support user trust because they reduce the chance that a user's data will be repurposed in ways that feel like a betrayal. They also support compliance because they make it easier to honor limitations and to demonstrate how data is used. In exam scenarios, when a system is using data for a new purpose without clear boundaries, the best answer often involves defining purpose, narrowing flows, and adding enforcement, not merely updating a policy after the fact. Ethical advising must also address transparency in a way that is usable, because transparency is not ethical if it is technically true, but practically unreadable. Users cannot make informed choices if they are buried under vague language or if the key implications are hidden in places they won't see. Scalable transparency means designing communication that appears at the moment it matters, uses plain language, and matches actual system behavior. It also means aligning internal documentation so that what is promised externally is supported operationally. A privacy technologist advising ethically might recommend layered communication, where essential facts are presented in the flow and deeper detail is available for those who want it, without requiring everyone to read a long legal notice. They might also recommend change communication when processing changes materially, because surprise is often the moment trust breaks. The exam may present a scenario where users are surprised even though a notice exists, and the best answer often focuses on improving in-context transparency and control rather than relying on a distant document. Sustainable ethical design also depends on creating meaningful control, not just the appearance of control, because performative controls erode trust, and can create legal risk. A meaningful control is one where the user can understand what it affects, can change it without unreasonable friction, and can trust that the system will enforce it consistently across downstream processing. That enforcement is the scaling challenge, because modern systems often have multiple services, multiple data stores, and multiple vendors. Ethical advising here often involves pushing teams to treat preference signals as first-class data that must propagate, be logged, and be tested like any other critical feature. It also involves ensuring that opt-out means opt-out, not opt-out, but we still keep the data for everything else, unless there is a clear, justified exception that is explained. Beginners sometimes think ethics ends at the interface, but the real ethical test is whether the backend respects the promise the interface makes. On the exam, answers that include enforcing preferences across systems tend to reflect this mature understanding. Fairness is another dimension that must be advised carefully to scale, because fairness failures often emerge from data-driven decisions that are invisible to users. When systems rank, recommend, approve, deny, or flag people, they can create disparate impacts even if the designers did not intend discrimination. Ethical advising means helping teams ask what data is being used, what proxies might exist for sensitive traits, what errors might occur, and how those errors could disproportionately harm certain groups. It also means encouraging human oversight where appropriate, explainability suitable for the context, and monitoring that detects drift in outcomes over time. In cloud-scale environments, automated decisions can affect large populations quickly, so early ethical review is crucial. This is not about banning automation, but about designing it responsibly with feedback loops and accountability. The exam often touches fairness indirectly through scenarios involving profiling, segmentation, or automated decisions, and the stronger answer usually includes measures that reduce bias risk and increase accountability rather than assuming the model is neutral. Ethical technology design that scales sustainably also requires governance structures that support consistent decision-making, because otherwise ethics becomes a debate that restarts from zero every time. Governance does not have to mean slow committees, but it does mean clear ownership of decisions, clear criteria for escalation, and clear documentation of why a choice was made. For example, if a team wants to introduce a new data use that is ethically sensitive, there should be a process for documenting purpose, expected benefits, potential harms, mitigations, and user impact, and for assigning accountability for the decision. Exception handling is part of this, because teams will sometimes want to deviate from defaults, and ethical governance should allow exceptions while making them visible and reviewable. This is where our ACI thinking supports ethical scale, because you can define who is responsible for analysis, who is accountable for approval, who must be consulted for expertise, and who must be informed for execution and communication. The exam rewards governance that is enforceable and repeatable, because that is what makes ethics operational rather than aspirational. Communication style is also part of scalable ethical advising, because the way you present guidance affects whether it is adopted. If you present ethics as a lecture, teams may resist or treat it as an obstacle. If you present ethics as a risk and quality improvement practice, teams are more likely to integrate it into their work. Practical advising often includes offering alternatives rather than only rejecting ideas, such as suggesting less invasive data collection, using aggregation instead of raw logs, or offering an opt-in model for sensitive uses. It also includes explaining trade-offs honestly, like acknowledging that a privacy-protective default may reduce certain analytics convenience, but will also reduce exposure and reputational risk. This kind of communication builds trust inside the organization, which is necessary for ethics to scale. Exam answers that reflect this pragmatism often emphasize redesign and mitigation rather than simple prohibition or vague policy statements. Ethical design guidance that scales is guidance people can actually implement. To keep this usable under exam conditions, it helps to have a mental routine you can apply whenever a scenario involves an ethically sensitive data use or user experience. Start by identifying the purpose and whether it is necessary for the service the user believes they are using, because unnecessary uses are the easiest to remove. Then examine collection and retention, asking whether data is minimized and whether time boundaries fit the context. Next, examine transparency and control, asking whether users can understand the processing and influence it meaningfully. Then examine exposure pathways, including internal access and third-party sharing, asking whether purpose boundaries are enforced. After that, consider fairness and harm, asking whether the design could disproportionately affect certain users or enable sensitive inferences. Finally, ask what governance and evidence support the decision so it remains consistent over time. This routine keeps you from responding with vague ethical language and instead drives you toward actionable design advice. It also aligns with how the CIPT exam frames scenarios, because it rewards answers that reduce harm at the source and create trustworthy, repeatable behavior. When you can advise ethical technology design that scales sustainably, you are essentially turning good intentions into system-level guardrails that remain effective even as products, teams, and cloud services evolve. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, this matters because many questions are testing whether you can recognize the difference between a one-off fix and a scalable design improvement, and whether you can recommend actions that preserve trust over time. Ethical advising that scales is grounded in privacy-protective defaults, purpose boundaries, meaningful user control, and clear governance that assigns accountability and produces evidence. It also treats fairness and harm as design considerations, not as afterthoughts, and it communicates in a way that teams can implement without feeling attacked. If you carry forward this mindset, you'll find that ethical design becomes less like an abstract debate and more like a set of practical patterns you can apply repeatedly. That is what sustainable ethics looks like in technology. Not perfection, but consistent choices that respect people, reduce unnecessary exposure, and keep the system aligned with the context users believe they are in.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.